on with lecture 1, part 2, what economics is not. And here, again, I want you to separate economics from finance, money, commerce, business, Wall Street, zero-sum games. Economics is more like applied philosophy. What we're interested in is understanding societies and how they're structured so that if the winners win more than the losers lose, on net, it's good policy. On net, it's something that we want to promote. Now you can say that sounds relatively cold-hearted. You know, there are losers too. What about them? Well, yeah, that's true. Any policy is going to have winners and losers, right? I mean, it may be win-win, but if it's not, it will be a question of whether the winners win more than the losers lose. And if that's the case, then we will advocate for that policy. That's just like saying the benefits exceed the costs. And so economics, even though it's this idea of value created by trade, that's one way to think about it, where we have win-win for everybody. We also have value created by policy, in which the government comes in and adds rules to the system. And it's not just total laissez-faire capitalism where anything goes. No, that's why we have seatbelt rules. That's why we have no drinking and driving rules. That's why we have questions about air pollution, water pollution, hunting regulations, because, you know, each of us on our own, you know, if we do whatever we want, that's really not a problem until it affects other people. And in Wyoming, there's fewer people. I mean, with 500,000 plus people, chances of affecting someone else are smaller. But in Mexico City, with 30 million people, the chances of me affecting you or you affecting someone else is huge because there are so many people. Or in India or China, right? I mean, you think about China with 1.2 or 3 billion people now, or India with about the same, right? I mean, you have so many people, it's just hard to get your head wrapped around, and clearly their actions interact, and there are spillover effects between what I do and what you do. It's impossible to avoid. And so we do have government policy. If everything could be done by a market, then it's all win-win. But not everything can be done by a market, as we'll talk about later on. A lot of things are non-market goods. You know, you're trying to provide human rights, civil rights, healthcare rights, gender equality, racial equality, all the things where, as a human, you want people to be able to be equal. Well, that's not what the market does. The market isn't worried about equality. The market is worried about efficiency. And so the market is moving things along, trying to search for win-win, trying to make sure that costs are reduced. And if I win a little bit more than you win, and I keep winning a little bit more than you win, eventually the distribution of income is going to be very unequal. Now, if you want to do something about that because you think that everyone needs a basic safety net, right? They need a shelter, they need food, they need education, they need health care. All these things we take as sort of this basic human right. The market doesn't deliver that. Value created by trade through a market doesn't do that. That's government intervention. And now what economics becomes is this applied philosophy of how do we balance efficiency through the market with equity through government, because we don't necessarily want, or not not everyone necessarily wants the market to dictate the allocation of resources, right? Because resources are scarce. People demand Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all these different ways that we protect the elderly, we protect children. None of that's provided by the market. Most of that's provided by government policy. So there is this constant tension, and that's what economics is looking at, right? Win-win through the market, winners winning more than losers losing through government intervention, such that the goal is everyone is better off. And not just in terms of money, but in terms of well-being and happiness. Right? So it's pretty philosophical, and it's not just thinking about uh, dollars and cents as you would in finance and in business. Right. Again, so I've said this a little bit. Zero sum world, that's just a transfer of wealth. I win, you lose. The world is not zero sum in economics. Right? Modern economics believes the opposite. We trade, we both gain. Buyers win by paying less than their maximum willingness to pay. Sellers win by receiving more than their minimum willingness to accept. Okay, so let's think of economics then as a science. You can think of economics, what we call positive economics. That is how things are. This is like an ecologist going out walking in the woods, taking notes about different animals, different birds, different ecosystems, and just dictating what he or she sees. I mean, that's what economists do too. What is an economic system? Capitalism, communism, socialism, a third way. There's balancing between markets and governments. How do economic systems work? Do they work efficiently in that they get the most bang for the buck? Are they very unequal in that the majority of wealth falls to the winner? Is it a winner-take-all system so that 80% of the population has 10% of the wealth, whereas the top 20% has 90% of the wealth? Why do economic systems fail? I mean, why did we collapse? Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Communism back in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, the Soviet Union was a huge economic system that included Russia, all the Eastern European countries. Why did that fall in on itself? How did it essentially become rotten at its core, and just like an old tree that the insides of it become rotten, it eventually falls down? Whereas current China, it's also a communist system, but it's been growing at a rate of 10 to 12% per year for the last 2-3 decades, which means their standard of living has been increasing incredibly fast. And it's super important just to try to describe that in detail. What is economic growth? Well, economic growth is the idea is that your standard of living is increasing every year. We're not stagnating at a standard of living, say, that we had in the 1500s. I mean, if you think about this for a second. Imagine where you would be if you were born 200 years ago. Would you be in college, listening to me talk over the computer? No. Most likely, 99% of us that are here at the University of Wyoming right now would be doing something else. Either we would have died because of the childhood mortality rate was much higher. We would probably be in some form of agriculture, doing some form of menial labor, doing something that was not even remotely close to this intellectual exercise of thinking about what economics means. We would have been scraping by day to day, and some of us living to be 30, some of us living to be 40, but very few of us having the same average life expectancy we have today. That's what economic growth does. Economic growth increases our standard of living day by day, year by year, so that things that we have now that we just take for granted, wireless at most places, we didn't have 50 years ago. We didn't have Even 20 years ago, wireless everywhere. This progress is something that we just take for granted. Do economic institutions promote social order? So, in other words, does capitalism promote social order? Well, yes and no. It promotes social order in the sense that people can go out and buy what they need, but it also creates some social stress when there's a real discrepancy in wealth. Like I said, if 10% of the population owns 90% of the wealth based on capitalism, the bottom 90% or 80% of people are eventually going to have enough. And you will have a revolution, you will have a civil war. A lot of things get triggered when, say the Russian Revolution, when they're looking at the Tsar and his family and saying, why do they have all this money and we're peasants and we're starving to death? I mean, it was ripe for someone to come in and say, let's go take what's ours. And you have an entire revolution, French Revolution, the US Revolution. Here are a couple links that you can take a look at. The Nobel Prize in Economics, we'll go into some detail on this. You can go there. It's the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, works to hand out the Nobel Prizes in economics. And you can also go listen to Robert Schiller's argument for economists here on this link. And he's a Nobel laureate, and he was past president of the main association of economists in the United States, the American Economic Association. Those are both worth looking at on your own time here. We're going to not be able to look at them during this talk. Okay, we can also think of economics as an art, and that's called normative economics. It's how things should be. So, what is the right distribution of wealth? Everyone gets the same amount? Or is it fine that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? Should we define everything as only acceptable if it's win-win? Or if it's win-lose, should a policy be accepted if the winners win more than the losers lose, as we said before? And so as an art, you're constantly debating what is the right way to split money. I mean, think about, if you're sharing a house with roommates, what's the best way for you and your roommates to figure out a plan to clean the kitchen, clean the toilet, clean the house in general? There's got to be a right way to do it. I mean, if somebody's an absolute slob and they never clean up, and you're super tidy and you have to clean up all the time, well, eventually that ain't going to work, right? That ain't the right distribution of work for reward. And so you have to make these arguments with people all the time, given everybody's got a different idea of what's good and what's bad. Economics as an art tries to balance that assessment. We're trying to figure out the benefits of a particular incentive system. All right, so the incentive system for cleaning the bathroom is I do it every other day and you do it the other days. The incentive system is if you want to pay me to clean the bathroom all the time, I'll clean all the bathroom all the time if you pay me an extra $100 a week, right? That's an incentive system. And we're constantly doing this benefit cost analysis of weighing the benefits and the costs of all this stuff. What gets tricky, again, is the benefits and costs in economics are not necessarily price times quantity. They're not necessarily the price you see in the marketplace. They're the benefits you get by thinking about, well, what could I be doing? And the costs are, well, what am I giving up to do this? We'll get more into this idea of benefits and costs, and they're a little more philosophical than just dollar signs. They're really more about the road not taken, right? So the cost of me for listening to this lecture is I am not watching the latest episode of Schitt's Creek, right? That's the cost. The cost is not that I had to turn on my computer and I'm running it through electricity and I'm spending money on power and this and that. That's a price, but that's not a cost. The cost is what's called an opportunity cost. What could you have been doing your next best alternative. There's also another link here that you can go explore on why economists dominate policy. In short, it's because we're willing to jump into the middle of all this and argue about all these points. We're not shy about trying to balance benefits and costs. We've done it, and I'll talk about it next week a little bit for COVID-19. Here, folks at the University of Wyoming were the first guys to do a benefit cost analysis on COVID-19, on whether or not a social distancing policy and an isolation policy is worth it in terms of the value of saved lives. And that was pretty, we were way out in front of everybody, and we'll talk about how we got there. But again, here's another one you can have a look at. Again, economics as an art. Well, what about happiness as an indicator of how well the economy is doing? Here's a little talk about it at the World Economic Forum if you're not familiar with them. And well, sure enough, wow, yeah, happiness would be a better indicator of how an economy is doing and how the people of an economy are doing than looking at what we call GDP, gross domestic product, which is just the price times the quantity of goods and services sold in the States, right? I mean, they're just goods and services. How you use them is how it makes you happy. But how in the world do you measure happiness? How do you put some kind of number on it? How do you put some kind of smiley face on it? You know, I mean, when you go to the hospital and they ask you about pain, they give you a chart with, you know, smiley faces to frowny faces to red faces as a way to illustrate the notion of pain. Well, you could do the same with happiness, a series of smiley faces, but who in the world is going to believe that as a serious policy indicator? And how do I aggregate that up over 350 million people who live in the United States? It's pretty tough. We're also going to talk about growing an economy versus stagnating, globalization, free trade around the world versus nationalism, which is a lot of what the politics right now is about. President Trump is always arguing we got to make America great again, which means essentially nationalism, pulling back industries and not outsourcing to China and India, but actually doing things in the United States. That's great if you're a producer. It's not necessarily great if you're a consumer, because all of a sudden the things that we took as relatively cheap, like a new TV, a new phone, etc., because they're produced abroad, now become incredibly expensive. Well, that's good for the producers, but it's not good for the consumers, and we have to consider everybody. Trade versus isolation, that's the same story. Cooperate or go it alone, again, they're all related to each other in terms of this idea of what's the right level of globalization versus isolation in any economy. Economics as an art, part 3. So there are real world policies out here. Here's a list of them. Just a partial list, but you know, emissions trading, we trade pollution, earned income tax credit, low trade tariffs, sorry, welfare to work, monetary policy, auctions, transport, deregulation. All these things are listed here are just things that economists get their fingers right in the middle of and make arguments both pro and con to policymakers who actually have to design these, given you're trying to either create markets or you're trying to create rules to help markets foster, or you're trying to create rules when markets go too far. This is just a short list here. Economics promotes social order. Well, this is trickier because now we're trying to use economics by setting rules and institutions so that as people trade, their well-being goes up, their disposable income goes up, but we have some targets that we want to hit. And the United Nations Millennial Goals, which they established a decade or so ago, are the following: eradicate extreme poverty. I mean, right now you got a billion people living on $2 a day. Is that acceptable? Achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality, promote women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, coronaviruses, ensure environmental sustainability, and develop a global partnership for economic development. Now, these goals are ways to improve the life of everyone on the planet, not just in the United States, Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Russia, parts of Europe, right? And all these things are goals that we can decide whether you accept or not. Now, if you are an extreme capitalist or an extreme libertarian who you believe that the market should just dictate, and however it turns out based on individual liberties and freedom, and we should have as few rules as possible, well, that's one end of the spectrum. And you say all these goals, if they work out, they work out, but they're not dictating what I'm going to do because I'm going to choose what I want. I'm free to choose. And if I don't meet any of these goals, so what? I have met the goals that I've established as a person. Now, if you're more left leaning, all the way to communism or socialism or the third way of more government intervention, you say, look, it's a human right that everyone should have health care, as they would say in Sweden. It's a human right that everyone should have the ability to vote. It's a human right that there should be no discrimination across races, across gender, across anything you want to discriminate against, right? And that is going to imply some rules. The United Nations is millennial goals is an attempt to set up a set of goals that we as people, everybody, 7+ billion people, are trying to achieve as a collective. Now you can say that's impossible, probably, but you can say those are the things that we're going to strive for as humans. Ignoring boundaries, political boundaries, just as a person, this is what we want. Now, if you don't want that and you think individual freedom is the most important thing, then you're going to have a problem with these goals, right? But that is where economics comes into play, because by defining an economic system, you will either get closer or further away from these goals, which are more what we would consider human, broad-based, cooperative goals. Here's the World Bank. Again, they have two goals they want to achieve within the next 10 years, end extreme poverty again, and promote shared prosperity by fostering income growth of the bottom 40% for every country. So in other words, the World Bank is an institution that was developed after World War II that, along with the United Nations, as a way to try to create some kind of communication across countries. And their goal there is to lift up the bottom end of the boat, right? It's not just to make the rich richer and the poor poorer, or make the rich a whole lot richer and the poor just a little bit less poor. It's talking about making the poor have a reasonable standard of living, a reasonable lifestyle. Now, if you've never been to a garbage dump in a developing or emerging economy, I suggest you go. I went, and it just reshaped my mind for the next 2 decades, because the people who were living in the shanty towns around the garbage dump, making their life recycling by waiting for the garbage trucks to dump garbage and then diving into the garbage, metaphorically, but really to find the pieces of metal and all the things that are of value while their children played alongside. If you grew up in Wyoming, if you grew up in the U.S., you probably have never seen that. You probably never have experienced that. Now, if you have experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. Because things we take for granted, other people surely don't. And when you think about the distribution of income, and you think about your standard of living here in the U.S., and you think about standards of living in, um, I'd say, Bolivia, or standard of living in Nigeria, or standard of living in Chad, or pick a developing country and an emerging economy, and get your head wrapped around what it takes to give everyone a chance at a better lifestyle. That's really why people listen to economists, because we're willing to address these questions, and we're willing to argue and debate them. Influential economists. Here's a bunch. Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, he wrote Wealth of Nations back in 1776. And he really put together this idea that you need to link incentives, and you need to specialize in what you're good at, and you need to be able to trade what you're good at to someone with someone who's good at something else. I mean, he really was able to pull that together into a unified framework in which most of us over these years have elaborated on. We'll talk about the rest of them as we go through the semester long, but here's a list, and you can look them up if you're interested. One I'll point out is Esther Duflo. She was the youngest Nobel laureate in economics for sure, and she's only the second woman to be awarded a Nobel Prize in economics. And she is an incredible organizer of using economics to lift people out of poverty and to address gender inequalities, both in education and in healthcare in developing countries. And Jit Banerjee is her husband, and together they've worked across the world in a thing called JPAL. And I'll send you a link on it, but it's just JPAL. And if you're ever interested in a summer job, look up JPAL, because they are interested in hiring economists to work on projects around the globe. They probably have 200 different research style projects around the globe that attempt to look at these different aspects of how economics can improve people's lives. The two tools we'll use throughout the whole semester. I'll come back to this in the third part of the lecture.